all ages, and welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm Michael Martin, your co-host with my brother Mike Sauter. What's up, Mike?
Mike, I'm still playing with my microphone a little bit, but I'm
Mike's
happy to be here. It's Advent season, and something just seems to be unbalanced. But if that's the worst of my problems, I'm having a pretty good day.
That was intense, whatever that was. Yeah, Advent is an intense season, is it not?
It is.
Yeah, it always is intense, like Lent. So today we're here to talk to Mary Jo Oresti, who is, what's your title at the association? Grand Poobah or something like that?
Well, I used to be the Grand Poobah, yes, but
Okay.
I have recognized how things need to move along. And I am now a board member at the Association for Healing Education, and I do consulting and do some grant writing.
And which
Can
you
you say it again,
started
Mary Jo,
almost
the
almost
association?
40 years ago? Wait a second, Mike. Almost 40 years ago you started that?
Right, the association got rolling in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
And
So
it
it's-
had a very organic
Wow.
beginning. It started with conferences,
Mhm.
and then people said, well, gee, could we have a like a theme now that we could develop? And then out of that came a training and a board.
So I'm going to share with our listeners a little story from back in the day. So it has to be 1992 or so, maybe 91, where I started working at the Detroit Waldorf School as an assistant. And at the same time, Mary Jo, who was teaching there, hired me as her gardener and then passed me off to her mother, whom I love. And I have fond memories of working with Mary Jo's mom. And the wonderful thing about my training as a Waldorf teacher is there was no teacher training in Detroit at the time. And the teachers took it upon themselves to train me. And I think I probably received the best teacher training anybody could receive, because I essentially did a practicum in every grade, including kindergarten. I wasn't a lead teacher, but I spent some time in kindergarten. I did a practicum in first and second grade. I did one in eighth grade. I did one in seventh grade. I did one in fifth grade and fourth grade. I went all the way through, and it was wonderful. And part of what that training included is, and this is while I was working as an assistant, is that I would help Mary Jo in what is called the extra lesson. And I learned so much about teaching from Mary Jo and about child development. And one of the things, I'm just going to tell this story. So when I was years later, after I left Waldorf and I was teaching in college, because they knew I had been a Waldorf teacher, they asked me to teach a couple education courses, though I had never taken an education course in my life other than
That makes you a good teacher of education.
That's pretty. That didn't ruin me, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things I would do with the students in this education course is something I learned from Mary Jo. I'd say, okay, everybody, pretend you're looking through a telescope. So they pick up the telescope. I said, all right, and pretend you hear something in the far distance and you put your hand up to your ear. So they would put their hands up to their ears. And now pretend you're throwing a ball, and they would pretend they're throwing a ball. Pretend you're kicking, and they would do all these things. And then I would go through the class that said dyslexia or something, or diagnosed with dyslexia or this other kind of thing. And they're like, "Are you a wizard? How did you know all this stuff?" I said, "Well, it's phenomenology 101. You just pay attention to how people are doing." And Mary Jo will tell us, so much of her work and so much of what she got from this guy, Rudolf Steiner, in the curative education course is just, you read that and it's the most, it makes so much sense. It's
Yeah.
so commonsensical, but there's nothing mysterious at it at all, but it's such a sound human anthropology, especially about the incarnating child. And I learned so much from Mary Jo from doing this stuff, and I love her to death. I love her to death so much that she is my second oldest son's godmother, and And we have we're like brother and sister. I have to say, we're close. So, Mary Jo, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast.
Welcome, Mary Jo.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is really great. I'm really happy that I can talk about the work and talk about how it's common with the work that you guys are doing too. So, I just was listening to Michael talk about this capacity that you have to develop, I think, to be a good teacher, which is the capacity of observation. And of course, you need to know what some of these things mean, but one really has to begin with that. And I'm just thinking about a lecture done by one of our presenters, Dr. Ross Rentea in Chicago, and the way he spoke about it was that when we observe and we put ourselves into the place of the child, it's really almost like a meditation, because you are really taking this internally in a quiet space and you're pushing yourself away, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can come to some kind of a therapy that is of a particular need for that particular child. So this is an extremely important part of the work. And I just wanted to tag on a little bit. I don't know how many folk from last week are here today, but one of the things that came up in that podcast was about Dorothy Day. And I just wanted to mention that my mom was one of the original Dorothy Day folk in New York, and I did get to meet Dorothy.
Wow.
And I met her when I was around 9 years old, and that has actually informed a lot of the work that I do now. And I think that is because that barrier between, self and other is very thin, or as much as you can eliminate it. And I think that's what also helped me, with the children and understanding what needed to happen, is being able to put yourself in their shoes.
Mary Jo, can I interject one thing here to say that, when we string together, 30 some odd podcasts and so forth, regeneration, when we were talking about the Grail with some people a few weeks ago, when we were talking about William Blake, a big word and the name of Michael's journal is the imagination, and I think exactly what you're talking about, that I always, if there is a theme here, and me working with young people themselves, like two things. I'm in a room here where I've counseled students for 25 years or so. And again, you talk to them and you kind of keep yourself silent. And what I would say before I knew any of this language is that the spiritual shape of what's ailing them kind of is in the room. You can kind of see it. But furthermore, that what you're talking about, again, is the imagination, and it's this fundamental power that is opposed to just thinking of superpowers and intergalactic travel and magic, that this ability, the real magic is putting yourself into another person's place, and I kind of want to keep on bringing the word imagination back to what you're talking about. And then it goes through kind of like an hourglass. It goes through what feels like a compression, but then you see that is magic. That is intergalactic travel. That is a superpower and everything like that. It's the fundamental gift of human being, to quiet me and to see what it's like to be Mary Jo.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's this combination, I think, at least it was in my work, to be able to, objectively look and then hold yourself back a little bit and then you let that imagination work.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that imagination, then you come to this picture of building a therapy or building a relationship,
And this, pardon me. And I have to say, this was so important, not just to my work as a Waldorf teacher, and it was great because the first 2 years I was a teacher, I was mostly an assistant. So I got to do much more observation of the children than the actual teacher could do, because the teachers doing all the stuff a teacher does. But as I could watch the teacher and the children while the teacher was doing her thing. And this one girl, I remember she was she was writing in her main lesson book, and I said, I thought you were left-handed. Because, well, I am, but that hand's tired. And she was using the right hand. And so I went to the teacher, when it was a really wonderful teacher. I said, do you know she's ambidextrous? She can use, and my son Tommy is the same way. He too, I thought he was left-handed. All of a sudden he's using his right hand. He got the hand's tired, Dad. And didn't look any different. Now, that's not usually what you see in students who have a problem in handedness. And I wonder, Mary Jo, if you could give us, and especially our listeners, a kind of a brief overview of the incarnating child and what it is we work with as Waldorf teachers.
I'd love it. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, put simply, in Waldorf education, and specifically, of course, in the ed support work that I was doing, what we're trying to do is to help the physical body become a vessel for, you might say, the soul and the incarnating individuality. So if I'm just going to use my hand as a gesture here, if we think of this as being the physical body and also the chi, or the energy body, and then here's the soul and the spirit of the child, the spirit that goes through time and different incarnations. And what one would hope for is that it could go like this, right? A nice, easy, smooth fit. And, at night, of course, the soul goes out and the morning comes back in. But for a lot of folk, it's not a equally spaced or smooth vessel. It might be a little, crinkled up. So when the soul spirit tries to come in, it can't quite do it. And in that, shall we say, aggravation gets manifested as what people call learning challenges or learning disabilities or ADD or dyslexia or behavioral issues, because the soul spirit just does not have that smooth entry.
Right.
So in education, we are trying to help this vessel become more stable and, shall we say, a better fit to the human archetype.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, of course, you're educating the soul through the pictures, the maths, the history, everything. You're educating the soul. But with the work that we were doing, that Michael just spoke about, is to get this vessel a little more clear. Now, one of the disciplines that I work with was called extra lesson, and it was developed by a woman named Audrey McCallum. And Audrey was a Waldorf teacher. She did a lot of meditating on Rudolf Steiner's work, came up with various exercises. And I was privileged to be able to see how she developed these exercises over time. She had sketches and then diaries that were the results of these exercises that she tried with the children until she developed this body of work called the extra lesson. So I think it would be a good idea if I could just give you maybe one example of what she developed. So one example was from some lectures from 1909. And in it, Dr. Steiner talked about earth currents and how important it was to understand that these earth currents affected the human being and how we needed to align ourselves with them. Okay, so in this lecture, he spoke that we should think of the human being. Now just try to imagine this. This is an imagination. This is a human being. Think of them as laying face down on the earth at the equator. Okay. face down on the earth at the equator with the arms spread out. Now, that person would follow, oh boy, I don't have the book here with me now. I'll have to go get it. But anyway, that person's physical body has a response to those earth currents. Now, if you looked at them, so now just hold that picture for a minute. And now think of the earth currents. Oh, well, let's take the water. So water, as you may or may not know, but it's true if you look at maps and earth currents, you will see that at the equator, the earth currents move in a spiral formation so that they spiral in toward the equator. All right. So in other words, in the southern hemisphere, they're moving counterclockwise, and in the northern hemisphere, they're going clockwise.
Like toilet water, right?
Exactly. And literally, you can cross the line at the equator, go 10 feet, and water will go down in a different direction.
Wild,
I mean,
right,
it's
yeah.
that explicit. It's really amazing. So we are connected to that. So how does that manifest? Well, your legs have the natural movement of it, pretending. So here's my right leg. My right leg will move like this from the hip. Now it's not that exaggerated, but that is its natural movement. And the arms move in the other direction because, well, it's a long story, but they are freer from the earth currents. So a lot of children, when they get overstressed in some way or another, either physically or even emotionally, but usually physically because they haven't had the opportunity to go through the stages of development,
Right.
They'll get reversed, and they won't be in line with those earth currents. And then we start seeing things like clumsiness, behavioral issues, and all kinds of things. So so I'm going to hold this up for a minute here.
Up a little bit higher, Mary Jo, a little bit higher. There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so that is kind of looking at that, what I was just describing.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the exercises that I would do would be based on those earth currents. Yeah. And have to do with the movement of the feet. And just to tell you a little story, there's a really good one called the threefold spiral, and it's helps to really calm the children. And at one point, I was the point person when the children who were really acting up, I would send them to me. And I would do a combination of deep pressure, which is, touching the body very strongly, not really a massage, but to give the feeling of, the child's boundary. This is me. This is not me. I'm in my skin.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of these exercises from Audrey, especially this one with the spiral. And I have seen kids who have come in, throwing chairs, gone through 20 minutes of this. I called it first aid for a bad day. First aid for a bad day, and walk out shaking my hand,
Mm-hmm.
and thanking me. So they're very powerful. And this is all about making a vessel so that the higher self can come in and getting the child to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, wow, wow. And breathe, of course, is a multivalent type of breathing. Yeah.
And of course, the famous, at least I don't know it's famous, but it's famous in my head, the maxim of Waldorf education that rhythm replaces strength.
Right.
So children, will come in and they don't get math or whatever it happens to be, but rhythm replaces strength, and so many things are done in a rhythmic way in Waldorf education, not just in, say, teaching math skills or multiplication table, but the structure of the day as well, and we live in an extraordinarily arrhythmical civilization right now. And one of the biggest problems for Waldorf teachers, and I know this, I mean, I haven't been a Waldorf teacher for 16 years, but I see it in college students too, is that because of that arrhythmical existence, not related to the seasons, not related to the turning of day and night, not related to anything in the natural world, not only do feelings of anxiety arise, which can't even be explained, but it disincarnates children or even college students or all of us, right? So you're not connected to your body, you're not connected to the earth, and because of that, you're open to all kinds of dreadful influences, not only whether it's biological, chemical, or environmental, or spiritual. And the work in a Waldorf school is I said, it's like you're just trying to create a healthy human being. That's the job here. It's not getting somebody into Harvard. It's you're trying to help the incarnating child become human.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, Michael, this is a very interesting thought here, because I think this, as you said, it's really an essential part of education, is to bring that child into that feeling that that they are in their body. I tell you, I just shared down. I'm not going to quote correctly now, I know, but he said, well, we are not these physical beings aiming to be spiritual. Actually, we are spiritual beings who are trying to become earthly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I don't think he meant that in a way where, to be sensual or gluttonous or anything like that, but just to get into that physical body and to feel tethered, to feel tethered to the earth.
And it's interesting. So with my students in college, and when especially when I have a lot of education majors in a class, I'll pull out a lot of this stuff. But one of the things that has never occurred to them, and this is one of the foundational insights of Rudolf Steiner when it comes to education, is the importance of stages of dentition. So I ask the students, so what are the stages when do babies get teeth? Right? When do they lose them? When do the 12-year molars come out? Or what do they call them? Wisdom teeth. And all of these things correspond to, as Rudolf Steiner would say, different stages in incarnation of the soul. And I don't know if you want to talk about the sheaths, Mary Jo, but I think that would be a good thing to mention here for our audience.
Yes. Right. Well, I mentioned this a little bit before about the this physical vessel, but there's another aspect here about how the higher self works through the soul and the life body and the physical. And one of the things Steiner talked about was called the constitutional types, and it's pedagogical, it's not therapeutic. But when you begin to understand a child through that point of view, you can also come to some good interventions. So just to give you a little example, one of the descriptions was called the fantasy rich child. And that doesn't mean that they have a big imagination. These are old words, okay, because he was around a long time ago. But basically what it meant is that when a child got hold of an idea, got hold of a fantasy, then it was hard for them to let go. So that would be when that higher self is having this challenge of coming into the soul life. And so we'll just give you an example. I was working with a boy, shall we say, he kind of fell into this description amongst other descriptions, because we do, we're not labeling here, we're just, looking at some tendencies. And a fire truck came by, and he got afraid, and he said, "Oh, is there a fire? Is there a fire?" And I said, "I don't think so, because if there was, the fire alarm would have come on." So we kind of continue with our class. 5 minutes later, "Well, I didn't hear the fire engine again. Maybe it's gone." Okay. 5 minutes later, "Well, Mr. Zettner, he was our super. Mr. Zettner would have rung the alarm if there was a fire." You see what I'm saying? It was like just could not let go of that idea. Well, for that kind of child, Steiner spoke about, well, how do you get them unstuck? You get them into the flow, and then to give pedagogical, I wouldn't call them interventions, but a different pedagogical tools. So you would give them challenging movements and flowing drawings and singing and such. And so with this child, I had him make his own circus. So I gave him a lot of challenging movements. We got, bean bags and balance boards and all these things, and we developed a whole program. And then we invited his parents to this circus, and we made an invitation and got all dressed up and everything. But it was and really, really pushed him and gave him a lot of things. And he eventually really moved away from that kind of obsession. Now, you see, in psychological terms, he would have been called obsessive compulsive. But if you move away from that and you say, okay, well, what am I seeing? I'm seeing somebody who's stuck. So how do you get them to unstick? I mean, it's really very practical. It's really quite simple. And I often tell people, when I'm giving a course, this thing about getting the empathy, that phrase about walking in somebody else's shoes.
Sure.
Right. Well, I have them walk in their own shoes, but they put their right foot in their left shoe and their left foot in, wait, did I say, you know what I mean? I don't think I forgot where I started on that. But anyway, so they're walking around with their shoes on the opposite feet, and you could hear them going, "Ooh, ow," making all these comments like, "Oh, this doesn't feel good. I feel so out of balance. This is really awkward," and then I write down everything they say. And then when we come back to our seats, I read it to them. I said, "And that's how it feels to be in a body that's not properly aligned."
Mm-hmm. Doesn't Steiner also say, relevant to anxiety, that I've used this for students a lot, that if you're having a bout, or let's say a panic attack, and I don't know if it would work in a panic attack, but I do suggest it, you might try writing with your offhand, the amount of concentration that would take. And that's always struck me as, intuitively true. With the monastery where I worked for many years, the abbot was from India. And he would graciously have, and another monk would have, some college students and myself over for book discussions. And I'll never forget a day when the students were talking just about life, and these two monks in kind of real time were starting to comprehend the levels of anxiety. So a young girl was just saying what we know almost all young people today feel, as she was just describing what a day was like, that I wake up and I think it's going to be a bad day. And so that's going to manifest and all this stuff. And she wondered what she could do. And one of the monks said, I think your body will just give out eventually from underneath you, and you'll then just, and which is kind of true. Then the abbot, who's from India, just said, go get a shovel right now and start digging in the earth, right? And both these, the common sense wisdom that can come from many traditions are certainly funneling into these, profound insights. And what Steiner did was give them to more of an outsider than you, Mary Jo, and Michael, but I've read a fair amount. He's given these basic commonsensical things, flesh, and he's systematizing them and putting them in order, and it's exceedingly invaluable. But in a pinch, I'm not as well introduced to these items as you and Michael, but once you read the notion that somebody who's dealing with anxiety might take up a pen with their offhand and write, it feels intuitively true. So I can offer that to people. A, it's not going to do any harm. and B, it's likely to do a heck of a lot of good.
And that's one of the one of the brilliant things in the Waldorf curriculum that Steiner must have seen it coming. That all the practical activities there that are included in this, which are all healing at the same time, whether it's knitting or gardening or drawing or all the singing that goes on in a Waldorf school, all these things are so rhythmic and they're so healing and they're so connected to real things. To woodworking is a great thing that's taught in the middle school and in the high school in Waldorf education. So you're working with real matter of the real earth. Now, the funny thing is when Steiner introduced this stuff in the 1920s, people were much more connected to the real world than that we are now. But he saw then how through industrialization, et cetera, they were becoming disconnected from the real world. And it was it was a great amount of foresight, I think, that Steiner had to keep that in there, because you can only imagine, especially when we went through the pandemic, where children were, even in Waldorf schools, were learning in an online environment for God knows how long. It's you're and this is the word I always use, right? Like the real. They were disconnected from the real.
Right.
Disconnected from, and what I loved about being a Waldorf teacher is it was this it was a network of relationship. I mean, the relationship of the teachers to each other, the teachers to the students, and all of that to the curriculum, which was so ingeniously devised by Rudolf Steiner with the developing child in mind. For instance, Mary Jo mentioned when she was 9 years old and meeting Dorothy Day. In the third grade curriculum, I think one of the most important things in the Waldorf school is the teaching of the Old Testament as history and literature, to students. Because why? Well, a lot of different reasons. One is this is the age, what we call the 9-10 change in Waldorf education, where suddenly children feel alienated. They feel like they were basically kicked out of the garden, right? And then this is often where they start to realize, wait, my parents could die. I could die. And so one of the many, one aspect of using the Old Testament stories is it gives an answer to that, right? It gives an answer. It gives a context. And of course, part of that in that third grade curriculum is textiles are taught, or clothing, we could say, and house building, which is like once you're exposed to the world, oh no, I've been kicked out of the garden. What does it say in Genesis? What does God give them? It doesn't say skins of animals. It says coats of skin, which is, as far as I'm concerned, flesh, But on the other hand, you got to have to feel protected. Then you need, because the vulnerability that comes with that kind of almost an existential dread that does come up. And also at that's the same age where children become suddenly cognizant or even obsessed with time. What time is it? What time is my dad coming? Right. And so how do you answer that the needs to that child, and the curriculum does, but in the work Mary Jo does, it tries, because if a child is, and they're almost none of them are anymore, but if the child is, soundly constituted, the curriculum can move in, right? It just swooshes in with all of its therapeutic insights. But if it's not, then the work Mary Jo does becomes so much more important, because you need to create that, like Mary Jo said, the vessel that can receive the world or the education that it's being imparted to them.
Let me add on to that as a question for Mary Jo, only if it connects with what you might have said, Mary Jo, is that Michael mentioned these 9-year-olds kind of becoming obsessed with time, like reified clock time, that it's something substantive and real. And they feel that they're working under this puppet master. If you talk to anybody, I think between, say, 12 and 19, you say, how are you? And they're going to answer that question, which is kind of a big question, with, I either had a productive or an unproductive day. And that's so wedded to clock time. Did Steiner, Michael knows, and other people who've listened to these series of podcasts know that, I think a lot of the recent work, and it went back, but in brain hemispheric work, and that the more masculine, the right brain is obsessed with reified clock time. Does Steiner, I want to, all those things, Michael, that you were saying, they're true, but yet this clock time thing seems to be peculiar to our age, that very few people are escaping it. It seems to become more and more tyrannical. I just watched a favorite clip of mine from what I think is one of the greatest fantasy novels ever read, but it's The Last Unicorn. It means a lot to me. But in a similar moment, they're just looking at a clock, and there's a great passage in the book where they, in order to like move back into the garden, you have to say, that we once thought that hours were substantive things we could touch and grab and all these things. But then at this moment, the wizard just goes right through the clock. But could you say a little bit about Steiner and time, or maybe he hasn't like singled that as much as I'm doing here, because it is a tyranny everybody, not just young people, is living under right now.
Mhm. Oh, that's a really interesting question, Michael. I don't know of things that were referred to time in that specific way, but I would, if I put it into a slightly broader context, as Michael would say, we've kind of lost the background of the rhythm. And so rather than watching a larger, more universal unfolding of time and being respectful of that, you do this in the morning, you do that, in the evening, and it is not so far away in our culture. I am definitely going to date myself when I say, as a child on Sunday, we went to mass, and we went to grandma's, and there was no change. On Sunday, my father taught me to drive at the mall parking lot because malls were closed on Sundays. There was a recognition of things needing to be kind of cyclical, where there were pauses.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's happened really is that we have lost the pause.
Mm-hmm.
And the pause is where we integrate everything.
Mm.
If you learn a Spanish, if you're studying Spanish, and rather than plugging along for an hour and a half, go for a half an hour and then go wash the dishes and then come back, because it is in that quiet time that's integrated. When I do movement with the children, we move, or eurythmy, move, anything therapeutic, anything developmental, and then you pause. And this is not just in Waldorf education. This is in, just about every movement therapy that I run across, is that there has to be a pause for the integration.
Isn't it funny? Like we think, and it's a very valuable book, but this Eckhart Tolle book on the power of now, that's a great thing. I know that for me, yesterday as Catholics, we celebrated the feast of the Immaculate Conception, the Solemnity, and that for me, Mary has this great symbolic power of time and the flowing nature of time, as opposed to, again, the systematic chipping away of something. But also that whenever I say any Marian prayer, I'll be honest with you, the Hail Mary, whenever I use the word Mary, I think of the now, the present moment. But I think, we have to work on two fronts. That rhythm one seems so far away to people. It feels like it would take us years to cultivate that. I have, and people have gotten back to me that it's helpful. Take a real Marian devotion, and whether it's the Memorare, the Salve Regina, the Our Mother prayer, Michael, for what it's worth, in the Hail Mary.
Yeah.
You can constantly be calling, to precipitate the awareness of the now through Mary. But I think it's almost like a stopgap. It's like a field hospital solution to what you guys are saying about the development of life, which is these rhythms, which I think are more important.
Well, and that's the other thing where one of the great things I learned as a Waldorf teacher is the importance of the festivals. Right. I don't know if that's still going on in a lot of Waldorf schools. I've talked to a friend of mine whose children are in a Waldorf school, and they said, nope, they don't do that. They don't do the Advent garden. Oh man. Or Michaelmas. No, they don't do that anymore. Oh man, that's not cool. But that was that was a strong message when I first started to be around Waldorf schools, when I saw how the Christian year was celebrated. And because, and it's what's wonderful about Rudolf Steiner is he wasn't retreating to a medieval past. He was seeing, and this is what everything he did, even with biodynamic farming, he wasn't retreating to a past, but he was taking the goodness of civilization, of our inheritance, and bringing it into the future, or actually having the future come toward it, and I think, and that's important. And as Mary Jo knows, I mean, on those festival days at the Waldorf school, there is such a mood of joy and expectation, and more importantly, reverence that accompanies it, which children don't get, generally speaking.
Can you describe that reverence, Mike? Because again, for young people, it's kind of a lachrymose reverence, right?
Well, no, it's not. It's
silence.
pietistic.
Yeah.
Right. So, for instance, when we celebrated Michaelmas, we didn't just go celebrate Michaelmas. Usually it would start with a story. So the students, whether it was an upper school and lower school or all together, would gather in the auditorium, and one of the teachers would tell a story, not necessarily the story of St. Michael and the dragon, but certainly a story of Michaelic courage in the face of evil, in the face of darkness. And it's interesting because when you're a Waldorf teacher, I mean, you cultivate this on a rhythmic basis, this feeling of reverence in the classroom. I mean, but it's not sanctimonious, right?
Yeah.
For instance, one of the things that used to happen
We could
to me,
talk about like a true reverence and a false reverence, because
when I would tell the story of St. Francis in 6th grade, and the children, I would tell the story about the Francis meeting the lepers or whatever happened, and the kids would be in tears because it was such a beautiful moment. And sometimes the teacher would be in tears as well, right? Got carried away with that one. But that's one example of this. But there are so many moments in a Waldorf school. Right now, it's Advent. So at least we used to have Advent wreaths in the classroom. And you light the first candle of Advent, and we would sing that great carol by Eleanor Fargen, "People Look East," with my classes. And if I didn't do it one year, they go, "We didn't do the carol. We got to bring it back." And because what's great about Eleanor Fargen, what an intuitive woman she was, is that carol goes through the kingdoms of nature in procession, from the mineral kingdom to the plant kingdom to the animal kingdom to the human kingdom. And in a Waldorf school, you light the first candle. And I even said it to my children, and then my kids are getting older, but we lit the candle the first day. So what's the first week of Advent? The week of the stones. And then we lit the second candle this last Sunday. So what's the second week? The plants. So, the first week we would put a couple of crystals at our Advent wreath, and the second week we put pine cones or acorns or whatever. And this week will be the animal kingdom. So we'll see what the kids come up with to place around there. But that is an active kind of reverence, and it's rhythmic, and it's connected to the world.
It's well said.
Right? It's not, and it's very simple. That's what's beautiful about it. It's very simple. Anybody can do it. But you have to come to that, you have to cultivate it. And I'm talking right now, not just to teachers, but to parents. That reverence is not something, and I think children are naturally, and I know this is one of the things I learned from Thomas Traherne, is children get it. And we typically educate them out of it. And children are naturally not just curious, but reverent in their approach to the world, and they thinking that the world is intrinsically good, that nature is intrinsically good, that their parents are intrinsically good, that God exists and the spiritual world is intrinsically good. And we're taught, our education actually brings us out of that understanding, at least in most cases.
This is a very challenging time, I think, for some people to connect to ritual.
Oh.
But yet at the same point, this is, to me, a real calling for the time. This is how I feel one can really help build community. And, when people come together to consciously have a ritual or some kind of celebration that recognizes the changes in the earth, even. I mean, that is just so basic and so real, and it's something you can see, and it's happening, and we feel it on a gut level, but it's connected to so many other higher things. And just even being able to build one's own, with your community, to build some kind of recognition of that, I think is a real healing thing to do. And this is what folk have done for centuries and centuries and centuries, where communities came together. This is how they got through their grief. This is how they celebrated with a birth. This is how they celebrated a kill so they could eat. And they had rituals. We knew that rituals is what helps to make an inner kind of fabric or in ourselves, so that we can so that these things that come at us from the world can kind of bounce off. This is that resilience you were talking about before, Mike, about some of the students and people that you work with, right? This feeling of feeling vulnerable and traumatized and pressured, and so I think this is this whole business of helping them find that inner part.
How did you get into all this, Mary Jo?
Right. Okay. All right. So
I think a lot of people how did anybody ever find Rudolf Steiner?
Well,
So
this is
freaking weird,
this is one of those things where you feel like, well, the angels are working. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So I was at a friend's farm. I was taking care of it while he was gone, and I had horses and goats and the whole shebang. And I managed to find some time. I went into his library. He had an exceedingly huge library, and when I walked in, the window shade was only open a little way, and a shaft of light was shining in the book. So I went over, and it was a book on eurythmy, which is a kind of very purposeful movement connected to sound and speech. And I opened it up and I started reading it, and I went, dang, I've been looking for this my whole life. Because I did a lot of dance.
Yeah.
Which I think is another reason why I connected to all this, because it's very kinesthetic. And so he came back, and I said, what is this stuff? This eurythmy Steiner stuff. And he said, well, there's a Waldorf school right in Detroit. And I signed up right then for class.
I'm glad I asked the question. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and here's an interesting thing, Mike. So, so what year was that about, Mary Jo?
Oh,
75 or so?
I have a very poor historical memory, so I'm thinking here a bit like mid 1970s. I did a little bit and then moved to Texas.
So just a few years after this, I was 18, and I had my first real job out of high school. I hadn't planned on going to college. And this is besides being a musician. And we're one of the places I drove a mail truck between an office for the A&PT company and the warehouses. So that was my job. I drove in a circle all day. But where the office was in Southfield, Michigan, right across the street from Duns Scotus Friary, which was and it was a beautiful church. I mean, one of the most beautiful churches I've ever seen. And we had beautiful grounds, big woods, like a pasture, this beautiful oak tree, which I actually have a branch from in my room. And there were these gardens there that were extraordinary, in an apple orchard. Now, I found out when I became a Waldorf teacher that not only was all that extraordinary stuff going on, but that's what the Teacher Training Institute was. And that garden was actually built by Alan York and my friend Mike Siebenborg. And Alan York is the guy who kind of revolutionized the wine industry some 25 years ago. If you want to see it in there, there's a film that came out a couple of years ago called The Biggest Little Farm. And Alan dies halfway through the film. Spoiler alert.
Wow.
But he was an important figure. And here, all my friends, Mary Jo, all my former colleagues, were right, 100 feet away from me inside the monastery while I was out there eating my lunch in the garden.
Fascinating.
And never met any of them until I worked at a bookstore, and I met a couple of them, and then I was hired as the assistant. And then it took a little while till I realized, wow, I was in this aura this whole time, talking about magic and talking about your angels taking care of you, because I had never planned on being a teacher.
Uh-huh.
Right. I'd like to just tell a short story about a student, if I may, and then I would feel really remiss if I didn't talk about, believe it or not, balance, but in a physical way. So just about how things come to us destiny-wise. When I first started teaching, I had 3 children who could not read. I was tutoring them. We were not getting very far. One of them had one of the best teachers in the world. His parents were Rhodes Scholars. I mean, we were talking high intellect. He's in the 6th grade, can barely get through a sentence. I am bereft. It's my 2nd year teaching. I really don't know what I'm doing. So, you just do what you do in a situation like that. And, you try to put out a question.
Fake it till you make it.
Right. And so then I was rolling around in the library, pulled out a book, opened it up, and it was a short story about Nellie Bly, who, as we know, was this just intrepid reporter, got herself locked up in an insane institution and everything so she could write a story. So I said, why not? So we took it out, read it, more or less, me reading, and then we went on interviews. We interviewed at our office secretary. We went down to, I got an interview with the director of the museum, the Children's Museum downtown. And, we really made an effort. So these kids can hardly write, but we're still asking questions and so on, putting them together, and had our little interview book. And lo and behold, all of them really started reading by the end of the year. But that isn't the real story. But the real story is the boy who I was thinking about the most, who was having the hardest trouble with the written word, who then learned to read, became a documentary filmmaker. Now, I'm not saying he became a documentary filmmaker because in 6th grade he had Miss Oresti who taught him a story about Nellie Bly. What I'm saying is that child put out the call. And that call was about his destiny and what he was going to be. Mm-hmm. And as an adult who was in his sphere,
right,
I was smart enough to listen. Mm-hmm. Or my angel hit me over the head with a 2x4.
Yeah, sure. That's how it goes for me. Yeah, I'm a slow learner.
It's there with the 2x4. There is this very strong responsibility to be able to listen to the child's destiny as well. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's that, that murky and out there. And sometimes it's really, really very practical. And I wanted to just speak a little bit about one of the real practical parts of watching and listening. And that is that most people, many people today, a lot of people today have got issues with balance. Now, I'm not talking that they're falling off bicycles or stumbling or anything. It's a very subtle challenge. And you can tell about your balance if you stand, for instance, on one foot and close your eyes and see if you can count. and some people will really wobble a lot. So it's this subtle sense of balance, because we get balance from 3 different areas: from our eyes, from our muscles, which tell us how we're standing, and also from the vestibular part of the ear. And it's often this vestibular part which is not working properly. And with all the allergies and things that folk have, this of course gets disturbed here, that fluid in the ear.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens then, and this is really the basis of a lot of sensory work, what happens is that when a sense isn't working well, especially the sense of balance with its organic process in the ear, the higher area of the brain, which we would call the executive function or the frontal lobe work, and that's your working memory, your decision-making abilities, and so on. The frontal part of the brain then takes over and pays attention to what should be happening in the body naturally. So it gets preoccupied with a bodily function when it should be free for, one might say, intellectual work. So therefore, you can have a child, let's say in 6th grade, who is understanding the geometry one day, comes back the next day, can't remember anything. You see, they have the intellectual capacity to understand, but the balance is off enough so that the higher cortical area of the brain has to put the body in balance and isn't there for working memory.
Fascinating.
So we do a lot of balance work in the program. So that can be something as fun as, for little kids, rolling on the floor, but pausing. Remember the important pause, so that the fluid in the ear can balance itself, like that carpenter's, what's that called again? Carpenter's plane.
Yeah.
The little ball in it. And then with older children, you can do exercises just as simply as standing and then putting your head to your knee, like on the right side, and then on the left side, and then pausing, and again, moving slowly, right. So you have to pause so the fluid can center itself. Left. So there's just very simple movement exercises like that actually can come from OT or physical therapy. And this will, shall we say, clear the ear. And that would be extremely therapeutic to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting now. I was just talking about this the other day with somebody. The high prevalence of children getting ear infections, for instance, really. And I had a girl when I was at the Waldorf school. This girl, her head was always full of phlegm. I mean, this girl could barely breathe. And Mary and Joel remember this girl. And then they finally figured it out and she had an operation on her ear. And she was, in a public school, she would have been classified as learning disabled or something. But she went from 0 to 60 in a few weeks. All of a sudden, she was with the program. She was reading at grade level or even better. All of a sudden, and where she had just struggled. And the reason she not only could she not hear, but she wasn't balanced. So what Mary Jo was talking about is that frontal lobe was too busy trying to do other things. And what happened, and I noticed with my own children, and I just talked to a doctor about this too, and a parent, is that it seemed to be that children who had been immunized were more prone to getting those kinds of ear infections, which kind of creates this, this rolling effect where it contributes to other kinds of problems and reading problems and balance problems, right? And my youngest five, not a lot of people can say my youngest five, but my youngest five have not had any immunizations at all. The older four had a couple, but the youngest five haven't had any. No ear infections. No ear infections.
Yeah, this is a big situation. One of the first books I read, a non-Waldorf book, was called Smart but Feeling Dumb, and it was written by a New York psychiatrist whose name escapes me now. But he was working with children in Manhattan, very well-to-do, had a lot of advantages, but they were all doing very poorly in school, even though they scored high intellectually. And he noticed, as a psychiatrist, in their medical files, that they all had car sickness. So he gave them all Dramamine for that. And then, lo and behold, they began to do much better in school. So he started researching this. And of course, what the Dramamine does is it helps with the balance. Mm-hmm. So he actually was one of the first mainstream people who came to this thought that balance was important for functioning in school. And, of course, we know from our work with Waldorf that this nourishing of the senses, of all the senses, is highly important in order to get a full human being. Mm-hmm. But, we're not the only ones, especially in this level of development. The problem is people aren't really listening to it that much. Right. The data is out there. It's just not filtering down to the school systems, which makes me very sad.
Me too.
I did listen to a short interview as I was driving on PBS, two women who were nominated for Teacher of the Year this year. They were both in kindergarten teachers. And they talked about, play, joy, sharing, movement, physical challenges, and this kind of thing. And I was so happy to hear that on the radio that a lot of other people could hear. Mm-hmm. But it hasn't been able to break the bonds, shall we say, of the wall between kindergarten and the grades. It's like, oh, that's fine for little children to play, but when they get bigger, no, it's
that's right.
Books, sit at that desk for 6 hours, mm-hmm. and you lose so much.
It's inefficient. Yeah. And I have to say, because we're running out of time here, but
oh yeah,
one of the things that Mary Jo did, and I didn't realize what a gift it was until relatively recently, is in her work when we were colleagues at the Waldorf School, is she brought in not only wonderful master teachers, I'm thinking of Janet McGavin, for instance, and but also physicians. She mentioned Ross Rentea and his wife Andrea. Was that her name, right? And they were wonderful, and it was wonderful for me to work with these people and see their insights about the students, and also someone who's become a kind of celebrity unintendedly. Tom Cowan was our school doctor for a few years there, and I learned so much from those people, about child development, about health, about all the things we've been talking about in this interview with you, Mary Jo. And I learned so much from you, which I am eternally grateful. And I didn't, these are the kinds of things that I think when I left Waldorf teaching, I didn't realize they were really part of me. But as we say in the biz, you got into my etheric.
I learned a lot too.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mary Jo, for talking to us today.
Mary Jo, real pleasure to meet you. We'll have to have you back on.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
This is so wonderful.
And thank you, everybody, for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you again, same time, same channel.